Welcome to Speak of the Devil. My name is Reverend Campbell, and today I am being joined by Warlock Jeff Bowling. How you doing, my man?
Yes, yes, at long last, the beard of knowledge has come to righteously defend the actions of your chickens. I'm so happy
I
to be
did
here, man.
not see that coming.
Me. Thank you for having me, man, and thank you for bringing up this topic. It's one that, quite frankly, just doesn't get discussed enough, and we're probably not going to do it any justice tonight. So sorry, y'all tuned in.
Thanks for the. That's it for the show, then. We're just gonna shit the bed. So what are we gonna do? No, this I saw a comment. Thank you so much for clearly watching at least some of my shows. I really genuinely, I don't know why anyone does, but I genuinely appreciate it. But I saw a comment you mentioned about that, and I thought, well, why not put together a show talking specifically about Might is Right? Because I've talked about the book. I've literally read the book. I've talked to Underworld Amusements about the book, but we've never really dissected the philosophy, the idea behind Might is Right. And I think, with you, I think we can pretty much get to a solid understanding, or try to anyway, because again, I'm only giving us an hour, so we're going to do our best. Before I dive into everyone in the chat here, today is actually an observed holiday, right?
It is. Today is National Prisoners of War and Missing in Action Recognition Day. It's a day that is set aside in the United States to honor and remember those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who went missing in action or were captured as enemy combatants, prisoners of war. Yeah. So it's a big day, and especially in the veteran circles.
Yeah. Well, I want to give a quick plug for Infernal Legion, which you run. For any Satanists out there who is a veteran or an active duty soldier, look it up. I mean, you're in all social media and you have your own podcast and everything, right?
Yeah, we're everywhere. We have an official podcast on Radio Free Satan. We're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and any type of social media thing you can think of. We've found a presence there.
Yeah, you got to do what you got to do. I appreciate you supporting those of us who have served or are serving, because sadly enough, not enough of the country they serve does.
Yeah, not enough actually gives a shit.
Robert, thanks for joining live. Really appreciate seeing you. Grigori, how you doing, man? It's been a bit. Miss Book Club. Valeria, how are you doing, hun? Really love to see you. JD Sword, we're going to touch lightly on it, but we're not going to try to pronounce those words. Jeff, how you doing, man? It's great to see you, man. William, thanks for joining live. Really always good to see you. Mike, what up? Who else we got here? Dwayne, how you doing, man? Thanks for tuning in. Jason, great to see you. Joaquin, my man across the pond, how you doing? Thanks for staying up. Fareeth, good to see you. Robert, I appreciate that. I really do. Thank you so much. Lilith, love you. How are you? Let's see. Who else? Zach, thanks for joining live. Vasuri. I feel like it's been too long, man. Way too long. Tony, thanks for tuning in live. Dallas, what is up? Jameson, how you doing? Wes Vanderpool, my man in Amsterdam.
In his house.
Thanks for joining live. What's up, Greg? All right. If you have any questions or comments, or you think we are full of shit, or you just want to, I don't know, pose a thought that you think is going to trigger us, it won't, but we'll address it. Put it in live chat. We appreciate even dissenting ideas, because ultimately this is about exposure to concepts. And if you are never exposed to alternate concepts, then you are just a lemming. And that's what we're trying to avoid by talking about it. So, Stephanie, thanks for joining live. How are you? What's up, Tara? Okay, let's get into this. We're going to start with a couple of definitions to break down what might is, what right is, and what might is right as an idea is. We're going to talk about where it comes from, and then we're going to bounce around some ideas about the philosophy behind it, and ultimately what it means practically to a Satanist and the world at large. I hope we can get through all of that, but the only way we're going to do it is if I shut up. So let's talk about some definitions, which are always stretched. So what is might? Might is a noun. It is the power, authority, or resources wielded as an individual or as a group This is important to understand. If you don't understand this concept, and it seems like it should be very simple, but people always conflate this with one form of might over a veritable cornucopia of forms of might. That hopefully we're
Right.
going to be able to address some of them. So what is might is right here. What is right is an adjective being in accordance with what is just, good, or proper. And one may pose the question, how do you define what is just, good, and proper? Is there some divine message or book that we could, I don't know, read and then understand, or maybe go to a pulpit and someone could pound it into our ears with their preaching? Well, you could do that, or you could just look at nature, because the idea of right is subjective. It is not an objective truth or reality. And understanding that point is incredibly important. Now, I think it was last episode of 9 Cents, I talked about how the culture of the indigenous peoples in North America before the white man came was vicious and very different than what we conceive as good, just, and right and proper. But that is literally their lifestyle that they honed through thousands and, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of evolution. Our very Victorian-based ideals are dramatically different. And so we have to understand that there is a perspective when it comes to what is right, in order to understand ultimately might makes right. And that is used to say that people who have power are able to do what they want because no one can stop them. Now, I understand.
Pretty much sums it up right there.
We don't need to do the show anymore. Awesome. Good show, Jeff. If you're coming into this either as a Satanist who just hasn't done a lot of studying, or as an individual who cares about other humans for no particular reason other than the fact that they exist, you're probably not going to agree or understand what we're saying here. But we're basing our ideas off of established philosophy, literature, and nature. And you have every right to disagree with that, and by all means, put it up there if you do. But if you're choosing to tune in, you're going to hear us out. So what do you think about those definitions, Jeff? Did they lack in any bit of minutia of what might makes right?
No. I think the definitions are spot on. I think the problem with the concept and why it gets either embraced into such a strange degree by a certain section of people and completely disregarded by another section of people is that it's so simple of a concept that it just can't be true. It seems to us that and by us I mean the general us of humanity, that there has to be something beyond just simple natural law. And I think that's where people start to get lost in the weeds. I think at the end of the day, it really does just boil down to a very simple concept of might making right.
Yeah. I think it's compounded, to your point about this misunderstanding that there isn't this sort of set of laws. As much as America is not a Christian-founded nation, it is a nation founded by Christians. And
absolutely,
the difference between those two statements is that one is this idea of a culture that you're raised in that will forever inevitably influence your thought processes versus actively seeking out that Bible and using it as inspiration. And it's not just, again, I referenced Victorian morals. This comes from Europe, and it's ultimately because of the power of the Roman Catholic Church all the way back to Emperor Constantine, where he foisted this religion on the world at large. And so everyone who is raised within that shadow of ultimately what it comes down to is fear and lies can't help but use that as a basis for thinking. We are greatly informed by our culture and the society that we were raised in. And there's only few of us, as we've seen through history, there are breakout groups, there's hellfire groups that come out and challenge the status quo. Those are rare, and Satanists have that same tradition, that same lineage of breaking out of those social norms. And this idea of might is right certainly came out of that same segment of questioning what was happening around the individuals that really brought this out. And this goes back way further than just the book Might is Right.
Right. Yeah. No. Might is Right is just and I'm talking about the book, not the concept. Right. The book Might is Right is simply one of the many tomes that have been written concerning this concept. The concept itself arguably goes back to the dawn of time, or at least the dawn of life, biological life on Earth, because it is a concept about life. That's a very important thing. It's a concept about biological life, not necessarily a statement about the cosmos or how the universe operates. It's a statement about biological life here on Earth as we understand it. And you could argue that it goes back to the dawn of time, but it was initially put into, I guess you could say, words or into an argument by ancient Greek philosophers. And as you mentioned, we're not going to attempt to pronounce some of their names because they are ridiculous. Yeah. But but they were the first ones to try and tell the story of what they were seeing happen in biological life. And as a result of that, it comes out of a martial way of understanding the world. It comes out of a military aspect. And this is where I think it's really important to understand that this comes from a military mindset. But as you and I both know, it is not always the best weapons or the strongest men who win wars. It's almost always the best tactics that win wars.
Yeah.
And obviously the ancient Greek philosophers knew this as well. So when they're discussing might, they're discussing the ability to win, not necessarily brawn.
And that is the great debate that comes down to modern observance of this concept, right? Because ultimately it's individuals who seemingly don't either know their power or don't believe they have power or just have never cultivated it, seeing a statement like that and saying that can't possibly be right. You know, I'm of worth, I'm of substance. My mom told me I was. You know, and then there's individuals who know their strength, who know their power, and exert it on a regular basis, and they say no, it's a fact, it's real, and we see it throughout not only all of history, but we're seeing it today. And what people seem to also try to conflate with it is a particular political or social angle to it, and it doesn't fall in those lines at all. It really comes down to the individual or the collective, which is generally controlled by an individual exerting their will or their right.
Exactly. It comes down, you hit the nail on the head with the word will. It comes down to the I guess you could say, Nietzschean concept of will to power. Yeah. That's what Might is Right is all about. It's about power dynamics and how power is wielded, how it is exchanged between people. And Nietzsche himself even argued that the only debate about what is right can only be had between those who have equal power. Anyone who is beneath them or above them is having a totally different conversation that doesn't even apply, which again brings Might is Right back to the individual basis. And that's the really important part here. It is how the individual creates and interacts with power dynamics in their world around them.
Hmm. This is a point that Satanists should especially sort of, tune their hearing aids into, because the truth is that if you're a Satanist and you do not use lesser magic, i.e. exert your will on the world around you, you're kind of doing it wrong. Like that's the point. It's acknowledging that you have power. It's working to hone the power, and then it's practicing exerting the power. And that is what it means.
Acknowledging being and Anton LaVey was very big on this. It doesn't necessarily matter what your power level is. Yeah. It is using what you have at your availability to the best, in the best manner possible to maximize your vital existence.
Yeah. So, as Satanists, it's easy not to, it should be easy not to use that concept and then compare to others. Ultimately, we're not a religion of comparing to other people or being or aspiring to be someone other than your best version of you. And so when you are looking at power or exerting your will, again, you need to look inward, understand how to hone that tool, how to sharpen that tool, and then you can properly exert it. But that is literally what we're speaking to when we're talking about power. We're not talking about the guy who bullied you in high school, though he clearly exerted his power and right over you if you allowed him to do so.
Right.
We're not talking about the girlfriend who broke up with you or the boyfriend who broke up with you, because clearly it probably wasn't going to work out anyway, and you probably shouldn't have kissed their best friend. So what we're talking about is...
Let's just be honest here.
Yeah. Or if you're going to do that, at least do it behind the dugout, not in front of it where they're watching. No, I mean, my point is that we need to focus clearly on the application. And so we can see this in world governments. Clearly, America feels this need to exert its might on the rest of the globe. And sometimes it does it pretty well, if not exemplary, and sometimes not so well. Now, you know, we can always explore
Afghanistan.
I was just going to bring up Afghanistan. We can explore Afghanistan in the context of a different show. But you can't argue that we went in thinking it was going to be another Gulf War, you know, day in, day out, and we're done. And it ended up being a 20-year fiasco. So who has the might in this situation? Clearly, it wasn't the United States. It was the defunct and corrupt and, in my opinion, retarded culture that is in Afghanistan and the Taliban themselves. That's just my opinion. But they clearly had the might and the right because they exerted it on us, right? What's that?
I said that in the military-industrial complex, which is quite powerful. And you know, while it could be argued that the United States military, quote unquote, lost the war in Afghanistan, there's no question that the military-industrial complex won.
Yeah. I do want to bring up really quick, because I feel like we should have done this already, but Magus Gilmore in his Satanic Scriptures has a wonderful essay, which is the primer for fledgling misanthropologists. I always mispronounce that. And then Magister Nemo has a really great essay called Might is Not Always Right, even though the conclusion of that essay, I would argue, proves the point rather than the headline.
Right. And we're going to get into that a little bit later.
But they're both brilliantly framed and succinct, much better than we're going to be doing here. So please do yourselves a favor, read those two essays. And I'm sure there's many more by many other brilliant satanic minds, but those are just the two that are in the forefront of mine. Now, Mike makes right. It's a society's view of right and wrong, and it's determined by those in power, with a meaning similar to history is written by the victors. And I've spoken about this in the past, about history is literally his story, meaning he who has defeated his enemies gets to write the history about him and his enemy because he defeated him. And that, you may not agree with that as being fair or just or whatever those terms mean, but that is the reality as we have come to inherit for all of human history. It's never a case where we look at the ancient Picts when the Vikings came and decided to ravage them and take over what is now Ireland in order to spread their farm and spread their seed across the globe, whether it was fair or not. The Irish at the time, or the Picts at the time, don't have a historical say in the matter. The fact is that it happened, and that's where Irish and Scottish came from. So you can like it if you want, or you can dislike it, but the truth is it happened. They have the voice, the victors, and that is right, because that's the only possible thing that can be right, because it's the thing that happened.
Right. And you know, to kind of, because I already know, I can already hear the comments building up in people's minds about this. These things do change. History does change. It gets rewritten. And I would argue that when a group that may be considered disenfranchised or something like that attempts to rewrite the story that we have, the narrative we have now, that is them attempting to exercise their might over the situation. Sometimes they will succeed, sometimes they will not. But in any case, even when we start to learn more, when people change the narrative, it's still just groups exercising their power.
Yeah. And again, we can't ascribe in every case a political or social side to that idea, because it does shift with time, as we've seen recently. So although all people have their personal ideas of good, Only those strong enough to overcome obstacles and enemies can put their ideas into effect and spread their own standards to society at large. Now, again, as Satanists, we cannot think in terms of fair or good or right because they're subjective. You should only care about what those mean to you as the individual exercising your will. Don't worry about other people, because once you leap over that fence, you no longer become an individual. You become a slave to the other. You become a slave to who you're catering your behavior to. You become a slave to who you're considerate of feelings to. And of course, there's going to be instances in life where you want to do that for chosen loved ones that you have around, close friends that maybe you want to tiptoe around because you care for them and respect them. But for society at large, for the average human out there, why would you ever care? They don't care about you. You need to focus on how you can be the best version of you and exert your will over them to get what you want. It's not,
absolutely.
it's just, I can't stand this idea that we see so much in modern society about fairness. Nothing about life is equal. There's no such thing as the concept of equality. There's a manufactured ideal that has never been able to successfully be employed in a society, but we have to divorce ourselves of those ideas because they just don't exist. It's all relative. Almost all of reality is relative.
And that speaks too with when discussing a topic like might is right or might makes right. It speaks to the satanic notion of stratification as well. All of society, all of humanity is stratified. Water seeks its own level. And so when you're discussing might makes right, it isn't betraying yourself to say, oh, I accept that might makes right. I'm going to utilize this understanding of the world to emphasize my power. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be people more powerful than you.
Oh, yeah.
In society, there is echelons above you, no matter where you're at, and below you.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a reality. Nietzsche framed it in the construct of master and slave, right?
Right, master-slave morality.
Yeah. I don't know that I would go, because those are such loaded terms, I don't know if I would go to that length in a modern context, because ultimately slavery is a very real thing still. Like, it's much more real than Americans want to admit that it is, but around the world, slavery is a huge situation that's still happening.
Right. And so it is important to point out that when Nietzsche speaks of master-slave morality, the idea of master, and this is something we mentioned earlier, and we're going to keep coming back to, that the master is one who has control over their own life and their actions and exercises their will to power, and that the slave, or the slave mindset, the slave morality, is largely, in his view, a Judeo-Christian value. So those who adhere to Judeo-Christian values. Now, obviously, as Judeo-Christianity wanes and starts to fall off the map, there are any number of philosophies waiting and hungry to pick up that yoke and slap it right back on the slave-minded. But I do have issues with Nietzsche's idea of master-slave morality, just like I have issues with the concept of social Darwinism and whatnot. I don't think they're complete ideas, certainly not as complete as the very simple phrase, might makes right.
Right. Well, and that's why I always find it frustrating whenever I run across anyone that starts to speak about Satanism and tries to apply, whether it's objectivism or, any philosophy that Anton LaVey took notes from in order to write the Standard Bible and codify Satanism. They try to ascribe those totality of those philosophies to Satanism. And one thing as Satanists we have to always remember is that we take what we like from something and we discard what we don't like from something. And sometimes it's that exact same, it's the next idea or the follow-up or the progression of those ideas in that philosophy that we disregard. Because ultimately what it comes down to is a rational, pragmatic approach to living carnally in this ridiculous world that we have. It's not to adhere to some structural philosophy that we never claimed to adhere to in the first place.
Right. It's and I'm going to paraphrase because it comes from the Satanic Bible, but it's just like Anton LaVey said. Man has a need for ritual and dogma, but ultimately, we should not be letting other people describe that dogma to us. We should be creating our own individual dogma that suits us in life, and that comes with our own morality of right and wrong and good and evil, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Completely subjective, but we as individuals, as Satanists, have to develop that for ourselves and not be spoon-fed it by someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this master-slave morality, we start with the idea of the essence of master morality is nobility. Values open-mindedness, courageousness, trustworthiness, acute sense of self-worth. Some of those I jump right behind, the idea of owning your own sense of self-worth. That's not meaning bloviating your sense of self-worth. That means owning up to who you actually are, the talents and abilities you actually have, the work that you're doing to improve what you feel needs to be improved on, not saying that I am the greatest, I am the highest embodiment of human life, bow,
Mind you, it's the same guy who said whatever doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. So he's fully admitting that, no one's going to have the answers. It's about the mindset.
Yeah.
Do you function under master morality or slave morality?
Well, and that's encapsulated in masters create morality and slaves respond. So we can see this very clearly in the power of any Abrahamic religion. Clearly, there are people in positions of power, the masters, who are at the top echelons or in even lower echelons of control over what we refer to as the herd, basically the general public who is adhering to these, God-adoring ideas. They are forsaking their individuality openly and willingly for some future fabricated idea, some spiritual pipe dream.
Right.
Clearly, we see that as absurd, but that is what we're meaning by master and slave. Sometimes it's the same religion that is exemplifying both ideas, which should be very clear to the slaves, and yet they're actually okay with it, and they're willingly going along. It's this idea that Herr Doctor put into play in one of his essays, that the masochist is actually the one in power because they're the ones allowing the sadist to engage with them, to show their power over them, and they have the safe word and they can stop at any time. So really, the slave is the master. You want to extrapolate that out to the slave in the term of religion. Well, all it takes is one individual to say, you know what, I don't want to be what you want me to be anymore. I'm going to just focus. I'm going to do me. And then that relationship's broken.
I'm not going to turn this cheek again.
The difference, and the real power of that difference is that most will never do that because they simply either are not aware that they could, or they don't want to put in the effort to do. And that's a big issue. That defines, I started 9 Cents with this entire idea that mankind was broken up in potentiality. And we just have worker bees as humans. They exist. Not every human is a worker bee, but we have more than you would think that we do. And that means we just have humans that go about their daily lives accepting the reality that's placed in front of them, accepting the limitations that are placed in front of them. They never try to break out of the mold that is placed in front of them. They're content with their lot. And I think that's utter horseshit, and we need to be able to break free of that. But that is the slave mentality, and it will be ever present in human beings because that's the majority of us.
Yeah.
As insane as it is.
Well, there's a reason why in Satanism we use terms like alien elite, and things like that, because it's not something that the common man can understand. It just isn't. Mm-hmm. Hell, the common man's probably never read a book a day in his life anymore.
That drives me nuts, but yeah, you're right. Let's move the conversation over a little bit to social Darwinism as how it applies natural selection and survival of the fittest to sociology, economics, and politics. Do you want to speak to that for a minute?
Sure. So this concept of social Darwinism, it's often argued that Satanism has an element of social Darwinism to it, and it does. But I don't believe that element is as outspoken as a lot of people would like to think that it is, or that certain critics of Satanism and the Church of Satan believe it to be. So again, as you said, it's taking the ideas, the Darwinian ideas of natural selection, survival of the fittest, and applying those into society in general, whether it be economics, sociology, politics, power dynamics. there's so many wildly different schools of thought within the greater social Darwinism sphere, and most of them can't agree with each other on anything. But what they do agree to is two simple ideas: the strong see their wealth and power increase, and the weak see their wealth and power decrease. Or in other words, the strong rule the weak.
Hmm.
There is an aspect of that in Satanism, and that is, as most Satanists are fond of saying, the strong rule the weak and the clever rule the strong. There is that aspect of that, but I think that any actual look at economics, politics, sociology, any of those things that they try to apply natural selection and survival of the fittest to, what you see is not that the wealth and power of the weak decrease. When that starts to happen, when the strong or the rich or whatever start to go this way, and the weak or the poor start to go this way, inevitably that breeds the grounds for revolution. And generally speaking, people that you would view maybe as weak end up rising up and becoming the strong. What we actually see happening, especially in societies like, for example, the United States of America, or in general the Western world, which is such a catch-all term, but Europe, US, Canada, Australia, the broad Western world, is that when society has the ability for everyone to become better than their lot in life may suggest, those two things go together. Now, the rich, and this is certainly an economics conversation, the rich may outpace the poor. But the poorest person in America is still rich compared to third world countries.
Right.
So the weak or the poor, they tend to go up as the strong goes up when you're living in a proper society. Now, it could be argued that in our current society, we're starting to see the rubber band effect. They're starting to go down while the other one goes up. And if that continues happening, well, as Ragnar Redbeard said, what man has created, man can't destroy.
Yeah. Well, and that's when we start to get into the argument that the concept that men can destroy the problems that are beset them economically or socially is true, but whether or not they have the will to do it is something entirely different. And we can see this extrapolated out to local, state, and federal elections, where the system of government that most of the Western world operates under is based around that we have this say in whether or not a leader or another leader has some sort of influence over our state in our society. And then we, by and large, if numbers prove out, we ignored the opportunity. And so we don't actually exhibit our will in any way at all. We just sort of sit home and say, well, what are you going to do? That's literally abdicating, your power. You're forgetting the fact that you have power. You're ignoring that you have power. And when power is presented to you literally in like a paper ballot, you're like, I'd rather.
It could be, I think, effectively argued that the system of elections in general is created by the powerful to keep the weak at bay. I think it was Mark Twain that said, if voting made any difference, they wouldn't let you do it.
That's interesting. That's actually a really good quote. And I mean, we should definitely have a conversation about this in more detail in the future, because I do have some stuff to say about it. But yes,
I do agree with the sentiment of what you're saying.
Right.
Like there are so many people who will not exercise their will to power, or just don't have the will to power to begin with.
Yeah.
And that goes back to what you were talking about earlier. The overwhelming majority of humanity are the herd.
Yeah.
I know that using that language, like the herd is frowned upon these days. I'm not sure why, because they act like a herd.
Yeah. Well, and Christians literally call themselves sheep. Like they're Jesus is, they're just shepherds sheep. And that's what they call themselves. So I don't understand why it's a bad thing if that's what they call themselves. So there's also this idea about right makes right versus might makes right. Right.
This was a very interesting article. It was a little hard to get through the language barrier, but I think I got the concept of what he was saying in it.
Yeah. So the idea is that there's this absolute personification of right, this idea of absolute truth. So right is theoretically carried inside the mouths and minds of richer men, but in reality, They use money power. We can extrapolate this again and apply this directly to religious movements, where you see any type of televangelist or religious individual in any position of power literally defining what right means, and yet they're the ones with all of the money, with all of the power, defining it. So right makes right is still personified in the idea of might makes right, because they're still in positions of power.
Right.
So
and there's that's a really important concept in that that I think a lot of people get lost in the weeds, because the media and the government and whatever, they're very good at what they do. They're very powerful and they know how to exercise that. But they are using the same tools that are available to all of us. We all have the ability to utilize the internet, to utilize money. There's people say this all the time, like, oh, the rich are hoarding money. Go get some money. It's not, like, it takes work, and you may not ever be some of these guys. Yes, they're gaming the system, but you can game that same system. They've shown you how to do that. So the tools exist, but to use your religious example, when a pastor of someone of that nature, someone in that position, distracts you with ideas of heaven, or uses language like that is in the Bible, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. That is a distraction to keep you from realizing that you can use the same tools that he used to trick you into this position.
Yeah. And for those who are listening to this and arguing that, maybe we shouldn't be applying so much religious dogma to this topic, we kind of have to, because that's how the human culture has evolved. The entire Middle Ages, the Victorian era, the burgeoning Revolution era, it's all informed by the Abrahamic religions, and it still is in incredible control of portions over this world. And so you can't address issues without addressing the gigantic Abrahamic problem in the room. And the only reason why I'm even addressing it as a problem, because let's be honest, they've been wildly successful. So that is literally might.
Yeah, they're exercising might is right in that concept. And we can always extrapolate it out. I think I mentioned earlier, like the concept of Nietzschean slave morality. Judeo-Christianity is the biggest and most ready example of that. But you can extrapolate that out to political parties, to sports teams. Like, all of these are the same concept, in that they empower those who are exercising their will to power, who are over these things, while enslaving the weaker. To use the sports team analogy, the old saying, oh, who won the game last week? The NFL won the game last week.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Pursuit of Ecstasy says, I would even say the mainstream atheism is affected by religious morality.
Oh, certainly.
And I would say, yeah. I mean, they're still clinging to those Victorian ethics, those Victorian morals that were ingrained in them, from childhood. As are we all. Some of us break free from them, but if you at any time
we still tend to fall into those traps, even if it's just language. We still tend to fall into those traps sometimes.
Sometimes it's a legal issue. We fall into those traps because of laws, and that's really what it comes down to, which are again informed by those same Victorian ethics.
Right. We can shift and talk about law for a minute, because there seems to be this notion that justice as doled out by the government is somehow fair, and doesn't that it somehow opposes the idea of might makes right. But when you break a law, it's a guy with a gun coming to enforce the law, and then they're going to lock you up in a big house that's patrolled by guys with guns. So the very essence, the very nature of government proves might makes right, because they depend on their might to remain in power.
Yeah.
And we could talk about anarchism and coercion and all that stuff as well in that topic, but that's going off on a tangent.
But it is a fair point to bring up, because ultimately we need to understand, and we mentioned this briefly at the top of the show as well, but there are where we find ourselves in this whole scheme of might makes right is very levels around human structure on this earth, right? Because ultimately, most of us belong to a society which is governed, which has leaders that exercise that governing power that we have entrusted in them, that pass laws that affect our individual lives. So we've literally put the people in power that impose that power down upon us. So whenever we feel like we're being stepped on, you can blame ourselves. And as much as we want to argue that the system is the one that put us here, we're the ones that allowed that system to exist because we created that system.
Very true. Yeah. The government always, in any situation, comes from the people.
Yeah.
And it can be argued, has been argued by people smarter than us, that the people get exactly the government they deserve.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. I think we have. I want to bring up a couple different ideas. We're already 41 minutes in. Sweet hell. I want to bring up different ideas of what might means, because ultimately, again, we typically think of might as brute force or literal strength over another individual. When we're referencing the previous essays by our high priest Magus Gilmore or Magister Nemo, they take a slightly separate view and sort of address that as, yes, that is a form, but there are many other forms of might as well. And doing any cursory research online,
as did Anton LaVey.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to run into the fact that might is simply will exerted in a form, and that form can take the form of knowledge, it can take the form of wisdom, it can take the form of skills or talents. Can you think of any examples, whether it's personal or greater, of using might in a way that is different than physically?
Okay, well, I mean, you already mentioned it earlier, but the very idea of lesser magic in Satanism is the exercise of will to power using applied psychology and essentially manipulation of the mindsets of others. And anyone who has ever, all right, for example, I used to be a security contractor, and one of my bosses at the job, a client at the job, he was a smoker, and it would say common wisdom is that you don't do things like smoke around the client or whatever. But we would pitch ideas and he'd shoot them down, pitch ideas and shoot them down, until one day I started going out to the smoke pit at the same time as him and made all those deals happen, because I figured out what his pattern was, and was able to apply psychology and trickery to get him to see things my way. Mm-hmm. And that is an example, in my opinion, of will to power, at a small degree. But
no, but a literal, example, because you exerted your will, you proved might over right. You didn't try to change his frame. You met him at his level and then changed his frame.
And I didn't just take no for an answer and stomp away like a mad toddler either.
Yeah. So Lilith Malone brings up an example that I was going to speak to here. Cancel culture has a lot of might. They can end a career overnight. And
certainly,
again, you may see this as bad or good, depending on where you land, politically or socially. But the fact is we're in a time in the world where if you engage in social media and you say the wrong thing and the wrong people hear it, you can be fired from your job. You can lose your home. I mean, absolutely, your entire world can collapse all around you simply because someone else didn't like your opinion or your comment. Now, I personally think that's disgusting, but the fact is you can't deny that they have the might. They have the power, and they're granted that power by others. Like, they don't inherently have it within themselves. If cancel culture was just one person behind a keyboard, that would have been an issue since the early 2000s. But it isn't. It's only recent that it's become a real issue.
And it'd be an issue very easy to fix if you were so
right. But everyone gives their power to these people, and hence Just like the priest at the pulpit, their whole community is giving them the power. They're exerting their power over a
Absolutely, yeah.
greater group. And in some cases, those greater groups are corporations. There are people that get to say whether or not your opinion can even appear online, which is another insane idea. But it exists, and it's something that we have to accept. So for
And
those
it's something you can see as well. Like there's always power dynamics are always at play.
Yeah.
Groups and individuals are constantly struggling and fighting against one another for a variety of reasons. And you can tell those who are, because, okay, so it is possible to have someone who is weak naturally in the, I guess you could say, the powerful class. And it is possible to have someone who is strong naturally in the weaker class. And that's why we see these things, like I mentioned earlier, revolutions and things like that. These things happen because when the powerful are actually weak, they're easy prey. And when the weak are actually powerful, they're going to overcome. And you can tell by watching what they call cancel culture, who in the group of targets is strong and who isn't. You know, there are several people who were canceled and went off to start their own networks, to start their own websites, to start their own servers, you know, server farms, to start everything. And they're doing wildly successful, even though they were canceled by a certain group. And then you see other people who just fade away into, you know, celebrity nothingness, who are targeted by it. So the power dynamics are still at play on all sides of that.
Yeah, and that's the other side of this that we have to acknowledge, is that it takes someone to accept that they have might exerted over them. Because we do see examples of comedians who just refuse to accept that they're going to be canceled, and they continue on. They just, no, I'm not going to acknowledge that. I don't care what other people say about me. I'm just going to continue doing what I do. And you can extrapolate that out to any industry. But, you know, we do have these movements like the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, that exerted immense amount of power. And you can even go back further to, what was that millennial movement when the bank crisis hit?
Oh, Occupy Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street. Now, the outcome didn't really exist, but they worked to stop traffic for a while. So.
Well, and that's one thing. There are people who are objectively powerful in our society, in all societies, and you know, I'm not going to throw out any specific names, but they're a good. If you recognize that someone is objectively powerful within your society, they're a good person to watch and see how they respond to things. When they start being nervous about something, then you know that there's an actual change about to occur. When they're not nervous, nothing's happening. It's all performative theater at that point.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, because you gotta be careful about putting those individuals on pedestals as well, or else you
certainly
have another messiah. Yeah, I mean, and so those would be the examples that I would present that are not overtly strength or power, like physical power based, but they are very much will based. And actually, I'm trying to find the Visiri has a great comment here. Might can easily be manipulation over muscle. The strong are more powerful than the weak, and the smart are more powerful than the strong.
Right.
And that's brilliant. It's absolutely true.
And I think we mentioned that earlier in the confines of Satanism. It's a pretty well quoted idea that the strong rule the weak and the clever rule the strong. And of course, and even in the essay by Magus Gilmore that you mentioned, I believe he even ends that essay by saying something similar to that, and adding that Satanists always strive to be the clever. Yeah. Which I think is a very, very good point.
Before we go into some of the contrasting questions that I have at the end of this, do you want to speak to egoism a little bit?
Yeah, I felt like a discussion about this wouldn't be complete unless we discussed the philosophy of egoism. And I say that because egoism is, I guess you could say, the undercurrent for a lot of different philosophies and ideas, including objectivism, individualism, certain schools of thought with anarchism, and Satanism, most importantly. what we're discussing. So the concept of egoism as a philosophy, it started basically with Max Stirner, and I'm not going to copy Kevin here and try to do a butchered German title, but the book is The Unique and Its Property, which you of course can get at underworldamusements.com. This is where Max Stirner presented the notion, the idea that the only basis for right is with what the individual can accomplish in their own individual life. So, so for example, there are some quotes that give this a little extra oomph. And one that really struck me, I really enjoyed, was the tiger that attacks me has the right, and I who strike him down also have the right. I defend not my right against him, but rather myself.
Yeah.
And that notion, that idea is that, the tiger that's attacking you has every right to attack you. You're in his. So we've talked about this before with hiking, and you see cougars out on the trail. That tiger is doing what he's got to do to survive, to eat, to whatever, and you've got to do what you got to do. And the only way there's going to be a justification of right at the end of that is whichever one of you is still standing. Mm-hmm. And then some other gems, I think, from his book. People try to distinguish law from arbitrary command, from ordinance. The former comes from a rightful authority, but a law over human action, ethical law, state law, etc., is always a declaration of will, and so a command. Yes, even if I gave myself the law, it would only be my command, which I can refuse to obey at the next moment.
Yeah,
and I think that
there's this absolute commandment that one must never, break, but it's just the law that we created.
Right, right, and this plays into The Book Might Is Right by Ragnar Redbeard, which was written. Redbeard, Arthur Desmond, was he had read Max Stirner, and in fact, he sometimes quotes Max Stirner in Might Is Right without ever acknowledging him. He does the egoist thing and makes Max Stirner's words his own, much like Anton LaVey did with Ragnar Redbeard's words. But I think it all boils down to, with the concept of egoism, it all boils down to this quote: with right, one always asks, what or who gives me the right? Answer: God, love, reason, nature, humanity, etc. No, only your power, your strength gives you the right. Your reason, for example, may give it to you. And that speaks to what we were talking about with might being not just a concept of brawn, right? Yeah. It's this idea that there's an overarching reason, this concept of reason. Max Stirner would call that a spook. He would call that a ghost, something we convince ourselves exists that doesn't, yet it still has power over us. Mm-hmm. But we have the ability to exercise individual reason. Yeah. And so our individual reason that comes from within us can then affect our world and express our will to power upon it. And that's where the ideas of manipulation and applied psychology and so on and so forth come in. So I felt it was very important, because we are going to have to discuss The Book Might Is Right, even if we just do it very quickly, to provide the backdrop of where that book is coming from. And that is coming from the philosophy of egoism, much like Satanism is.
Yeah, there's a lot in Might and Right that I think is ridiculous, short-sighted, foolhardy, but there is some wisdom in there as well, and you can't deny the truth when you read it, because objectively it's truth. I mean, and truth is always real when it's not backed up, not on opinion, not on personal experience, but on nature, because that's where we all came from. That's how we all engage in this reality. It's through the laws of nature, whether we acknowledge them or not, whether we try to bend them or not, depending on how you land on greater magic, or tap into it, as it were. But the truth is that, the only reality is nature and how it affects us and how we engage in it. And that includes maneuvering other people or moving around other people. And
Right.
that is I want to make sure that when people think of might as right, they're not thinking of the racist, bigoted, sexist bullshit that's in there, because it's there. But instead, they're thinking of the concept behind it, which, though it's buried and weaved into all those ideas, is not connected to them inherently.
Right.
Might is right
Well,
is
that
an idea that is real, and we live it every day, and we see examples literally every day of it.
right. When I think when a lot of people analyze the book Might is Right, especially with its unique connection to the Satanic Bible and to Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, um, they tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
For
And
sure.
they go
Yeah.
like, the only good parts of Might is Right is what Anton LaVey used to craft the Book of Satan. No, that's not true. That's not true. The entire book is worth a read, and it is jam packed with a singular idea, and that idea is that the consistent core of Might is Right is the individual is against everything but the self, and any means of proliferation of the self is the only good.
Yeah.
Might is the power of the individual, and that is the only foundation of right.
Yeah.
And so you can, and I could pick apart and go back and forth and say like, okay, well, on this page, Ragnar Redbeard or Arthur Desmond was extremely racist, but on this page he praised a black revolutionary, and both of those things exist, but it doesn't matter. Trying to break down the book in that way doesn't matter. You have to break it down in the sense of what can I glean from this, and I think that the power of the individual being the only foundation of right is a very powerful message, and that it's done in such an absolutely diabolical way within Might is Right, where it is just a rant. It's a 200-page rant about everything, everything that has stood on top of men, who has held them down, who has enslaved them mentally. It just rails against all of it, and you can see that in the way that it's influenced people, because yes, you're absolutely right, it's a very racist and very sexist book, but it was used by the suffragette movement. It was quoted in many of their journals and their magazines. So as sexist as it is, women still found empowerment from it. It was used by the Black Power movement in the late 60s. They were quoted, they recorded albums citing entire sections of Might is Right. Communists used this and quoted it. The labor unions used it and quoted it. Of course, Satanists used it and quoted it. And of course, the elephant in the room, yes, neo-Nazis used it and quoted it as well.
Yeah.
But as we've set up and we've discussed, there's so many dynamics of individual and group will to power happening around us at all times. The fact that these wildly disparate groups could all gain some type of inspiration from this book means it is a powerful book, and one that any Satanist worth their salt should read and try to understand.
Yeah, I agree. Again, to your point, it is very much a rant. He retreads old ground a lot in it.
Yeah.
So, you got to buckle in for the ride.
Yeah.
But there are audio versions. I've created an audio version of it as well. So, if you want to wade through it that way, you're more than welcome. Thanks for joining at the end, Jane. It's good to see you. Okay, so I want to ask some questions that a bit of provoking, a little contrasting to what we've spoken to thus far. But if someone is out there and they're saying, no, if everyone has their own version of what right is, then how can one individual's right, simply because they can dominate another, actually be considered right?
That's the rub,
when
isn't
perspective comes into play. What do you think?
I think that the idea of right growing from the concept of might makes it so that you can argue against it from a intellectual level, but as what I said with the Stirner quote and the tiger, if the tiger kills you, your intellectual babble about how it shouldn't do that doesn't matter.
Yeah, and the other
It
side of this is
just
that
does not matter.
because we've talked about the fact that physicality is not the beginning and end of might. If
Not at
you're
all, no.
incapable of exerting your might as a species, as a member of the species, you shouldn't have the right to share your idea of what is right.
Of course
Because you
not.
can't
No.
exercise the power that you have within you. And if you don't have it, then I certainly don't want you to use it, because it's going to be some sort of pathetic, weak version.
Can you imagine? You and I both, and we discussed this at length off of podcasts, but we both have issues with certain things in the way society is run.
Yeah.
And we talk about them, we bitch about them. Sometimes we do things to try and affect change with them. But can you imagine how terrible society would be if only the weak were in charge? If those who didn't have an original concept in their head, who could never invent anything, who could never write a good story, who could never paint a pretty picture, or who had no way of distributing this to the masses, if they were the ones in charge, I mean, that's a nightmare.
It's a dystopian future. Like, it's like the time machine. You know, you go back and there's just all these people laughing and playing and dancing, ignoring the fact that they're being hunted and murdered for their flesh
Right.
by the underworldlings, but they're just like, la la la. You know, it's just this insane, like, Looney Tunes world. It doesn't
Right.
make any
Or
sense.
you know, if and we could take it back even to the ancient world, because you know there's pretty good evidence that human life began in Africa. Can you imagine what the world would look like right now if all the people who had dared to walk to another continent had just been executed?
Yeah.
Because that's a scary idea. You know, they suffer the what is it, Copernicus injustices, and we never know. The rest of all of human civilization takes place on the one continent. We have no idea that there's an entire world out there that we could explore. That's a terrifying concept.
I do want to put one little pin in the board here. Anton is saying, I would love to kill a man who's about to kill me or Tiger. That would be sweet. And I would say, as Satanists, whenever we're referencing the idea of killing someone else or sacrificing someone else, it's through ritual, not literally going over and killing them. Now, you may live in a region of the world where, you know, maybe you have stand your ground laws, or maybe there's, you know, ways to get around and you don't take suffer any consequences.
I'll tell you this right now, if I could interject real quick.
Yeah.
Saying something like that online will get you convicted even if you're standing your ground.
Yeah,
so maybe just shut up about
it. Maybe don't. Don't say it. And here's the thing, like, as a Satanist, I don't have any idea of sanctity of life. I think that's a bullshit idea that was made up by other humans. I don't actively care about other humans that are not in my circle that I have drawn around those other humans that I care about. But the reality is that I don't want to kill other people. I'm focused on me. I'm not focused on others. If I was so focused on others so much that I wanted to murder them because they bothered me so much, then there's a deficiency here that I'm not paying attention to. I need to work here, not over there. So
right, and you know, this is so again, look to the natural world, and might is right being the key. If you look to the natural world, and let's erase the idea of me versus a tiger.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just take two tigers, and you put two tigers from opposing territories, opposing areas in front of one another. They'll growl and they'll scratch the ground and they'll, you know, proverbially thump their chest all day long, but they'll do everything they can not to fight one another. Because in the actual moment, when it becomes brawn versus brawn, even if you're stronger, you could get an injury from that situation. It's so much better just to pound your chest till the other guy backs down, or back down yourself if it means staying alive.
Self-preservation is the highest law.
Right. And you can always exert your will to power in other ways.
Yeah. Didn't mean to pick on you at all. That's I just saw, and I felt like I had to say something, and Lilith points it out. You'd be their slave in that particular case. Absolutely right. Okay, so here's another one. We're already over our time limit, so let's just do this last one here.
Sure.
If nature and natural behavior or natural order defines right, why do human animals seem to oppose it so naturally? Why do we as products of nature seem to so frequently go against our own very nature so often.
Mm.
Have you seen this at all?
I understand the concept.
Yeah.
I think that what is actually happening is not always as clear as what is said to happen. I think that it is a human trait to try and defy natural law, but they only do it with their thought. When in action they exude might is right in every step of the way. But in thought, they'll say, oh, no, that's wrong. That's terrible. And I think a lot of that comes from the idea that, well, if you acknowledge might is right, then you have to acknowledge that the people who are powerful are, powerful for a reason. And you'll never be powerful. Well, I think we've established in this conversation that is not the case.
Yeah.
Admitting that might is right does not necessarily mean that you'll never be up here. And of course, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be someone over you at some point. But it doesn't matter. All the bloviation, all the crying about well, might is right. It's such a terrible and brutal worldview. It is a brutal worldview, and that's just how the world is. And while you're crying about it, you're still living it every single day.
Yeah, and I would argue this idea that we saw come out of the Me Too movement, this idea of living your truth. I personally hate that phrase. I hate everything that it represents. But behind that statement is literally exerting your will, exerting your might, exerting your strength. Yes. So what it's saying, even though it tends to be used not directly in this way, but to your point, is ultimately using might, is saying that I'm not going to conform what society says I should be. I'm going to stand up for my individual strength and as I see my own justice. And I'm going to demand that other people recognize my truth. Now, of course, that only matters to you, as it should. But the fact that you could be strong enough to do that, I got to tip my cap, even if I disagree with it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because it's someone exerting their own will. And I respect that more than someone supplicating someone else's.
And they're using the system at play too. So it can be argued that there is a sense of weakness that you're calling on the government or society to do this thing for you, but that's the tool at your disposal, right? At the end of the day, use someone like Harvey Weinstein, for example, one of the, I guess you could say, biggest targets of the Me Too movement.
Guy. Justifiable, I would argue, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. From what I can tell, the guy's a complete scumbag.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it wasn't just people tweeting and people making Facebook posts and raising awareness and whatever else that did it. At the end of the day, they utilized a system that was in place, and they sent men with guns to pick up this fat piece of shit and drag him to a big box where he's watched over by other strong men to punish him for what he had for exerting his will to power on them. Yeah. They exercised it greatly by utilizing the tools at their disposal and the system that they could work within. Yeah. To me, that is a perfect example of might is right, whether I like it or not, like you said.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Is there anything else that you want to clarify before we close down our conversation today?
So much. As always, we could talk for 3 or 4 hours about something like this, and there's so many nuances I know we didn't get to. What I would encourage people to do, though, we've mentioned several things out there. The essay from Magus Peter H. Gilmore is within the Satanic Scriptures. Go get that book, read it. The essay from Magister Nemo was from The Fire from Within. I believe he only sells that on his website, but yes, go and get that. And we mentioned some books, or I mentioned some books like The Unique in Its Property by Max Stirner, obviously Might is Right by Ragnar Redbeard, and one that we didn't really get to talk about, but The Gospel of Power by Dora Marsden. I highly recommend those books to anyone who is interested in the concept of might is right, even if you're not going to agree with it. Read the book, read the books, understand what the concept actually is, and then look at the world around you and see if it applies. And maybe you'll be the person who has the earth-shaking philosophical moment that it doesn't. But the only way you can get there is if you go to underworldamusements.com and buy those books.
I'm reminded of Reading Rainbow, but don't take my word for it. Read it yourself. I loved that show as a kid. That was so great. Where's our modern Reading Rainbow? It encourages kids to read. Come on, people.
Right, seriously. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. And Jeff, it's always so great to talk with you. Thanks for joining me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. And thank you for coming up with this idea. I think it was a fantastic idea.
Well, I stole it from you, but I appreciate it nonetheless. Where can people find you online?
All right. So I got a lot of stuff in the works I'm not going to get into right now. But as we mentioned at the top of the show, if you are a veteran and a Satanist, make sure you check out infernallegion.org and all of our various social media pages. And yeah, for now, I'm just going to leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah. infernallegion.org.
Mysterious projects in the work. All right. Interest is piqued.
Right. I'll be back on in a month to talk about it.
Well, I genuinely appreciate you guys in the chat room. I'm sorry we didn't have an opportunity to get to everyone's questions or comments. The truth is most people see these after the fact anyway. And when I'm having an engaging conversation with someone, it's really hard for me. I tried to pull away and look at the different things being said in the chat, but it does become very challenging. So I do genuinely appreciate you guys' time and attention. I know it's a Friday night. You could be out with your significant other having a hell of a time, but you chose to spend it with us. I'm going to pass judgment on that, but I appreciate it nonetheless. So thanks for it. And if you ever want to learn more about Satanism or the Church of Satan, read the Satanic Bible, visit churchofsatan.com. It'll do you a hell of a lot of good. And if you feel like you know what Satanism is all about, whether you're a Satanist or not, you probably don't. So read the Satanic Bible and visit churchofsatan.com. Educate yourselves because you would be surprised. And until we can speak of the devil again, hail Satan.
Hail Satan.